So, Trevor, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited about it.
So, for those who haven't come across, what you've been doing with the growth mindset and Train Ugly and Learn a Lab, tell us about how you got involved in sport as a youngster and how that's kind of evolved into what you do today.
Both my parents were coaches, so I like grew up in a gym, and so it's like a huge part of my life as a kid. I played every sport, but basketball was kind of my favorite. I pursued that as long as I could. So I've always had that sort of in my blood. And what I do now is sort of the marriage of that plus another thing I really like is building and making stuff. And so I started my company like 10 years ago, and the idea was like, all right, let's figure out the best way to get better at stuff. And that's taken me in a lot of different directions. Like at first I did what most people did, which was like, oh, this is cool, this is cool, this is cool, this is cool. And there was like 30 different topics, and I just scratched the surface on all 30. But as I was in the game for a while, you start to see how different dots connect, maybe what topics have the biggest impact. And I would say over the last 2 or 3 years, I've kind of found my footing of like what I believe are like the most important topics and how they fit into the bigger learning narrative. But what I've cared about from the start is just like, how do we help people become better learners? What are the topics that could help the most people? And what's the best way to explain those? That's kind of what I spent my time on.
Hmm. So, what are those things that you've kind of, I guess, narrowed down to? What are those key topics for you?
I think there's like maybe 3 or 4 ideas that I think matter. One is just recalibrating what like the truths of learning. Like it's not rocket science, but it's good to put on the table. It's like to get good at something, it requires sustained action that stretches us out of our comfort zone, like period, end of sentence. Okay. It's good to put that on the table. But next, it's like you could ask a 5-year-old, well, how do you get better at something? And they would give you that same answer. They'd be like, you got to practice a lot and try new stuff and make mistakes. It's like, no kidding. The fascinating angle then is not to just like beat that to death, but just talk about, well, if we all know that, how come we don't do it very much? What are the barriers to sustained action that takes us out of our comfort zone? And that's where you get into stuff like fixed mindset, which is the idea that we can't learn a particular skill. We get into fear, which is like, yeah, we know we need to struggle to grow, but we don't like to struggle. We don't like to mess up. And so sort of the way we approach the learning process is, how do we knock those things out? Like, how do we create more of a growth mindset, the belief that we could grow? How do we become better at being willing to struggle? How do we become better at talking about tough emotions like fear, so we're willing to feel them a bit more? And we kind of believe in that bottom up approach to learning. So like, it's like, hey, you want to learn to dance? Great. Most people are just going to tell you, go dance. Our approach is, well, why aren't you practicing dancing? Maybe it's because you don't believe you can become a better dancer. Okay, let's build the growth mindset. Maybe it's because you don't want to look like an idiot. Okay, let's get good at feeling uncomfortable and dealing with fear. And as we develop those foundational things, the logic is, I'll spend more time dancing and become a better dancer. So we're always going to go from the bottom up if we're trying to become a better learner. I think that's the best way to do it.
So what is it that's driven you on this journey to really getting stuck into learning and unpacking what it is that makes people better? Is there like an underlying curiosity for you?
Yeah, it was a failure. It was like I said at the start, basketball was my sport. And I'm like, you can't tell we're on a podcast and we're on Zoom, but I'm like 5'9". But I wanted to play like Division I college basketball at Duke University, which is like the best college basketball program in the country. And that was my dream since like 4th grade. And I practiced all day, every day, trying to chase that. And I got out there for my first year and tried out for the team, and like 100 people tried out, and I was the last person cut. And to be that close to like living the dream rocked me. And this is something that still hurts when I think about it. It like caused a lot of pain and put me into a tailspin. But if I'm going to be real, looking back, that was the original seed. Like that question of like, damn, what could I have done better? And I think it's that question that's been running in the back of my head that probably got me started in this, kind of trying to fill in the gap of like, if I could run it back and do it again, how would I approach it differently to make it over the hump? And I truly believe if I knew the stuff I knew now, I would have been good enough to make the team. And so, yeah, I think that failure kind of fueled me. And there's a lot of other things as well. But that was like, to identify one like turning point, that would be one of the biggest.
So, I mean, that's a pretty mega one. And I think that's probably one of the things, a failure is always pretty good to kind of kick you into action or to make you reflect. But are there other things that have shaped your kind of practice in this? Is there any particular, influences from a research perspective or from a practical applied kind of perspective that have piqued your interest and guided you?
Sure. So at first, when I was like getting into it, I was more excited about like practice design. It's like, oh, how do you build a drill so you learn more from it? And how do you structure a practice to learn more from it? And a lot of that research is fascinating and I think it's important. But I think sometimes people get so obsessed with that they forget the mental side. Because a big part of creating a better practice is you need to incorporate more realistic struggle. We need like actually more challenge in our practice to make it better. But if I'm not mentally prepared to deal with that, I'm not going to get the most out of it. And so I think what's influenced me is this 1-2 punch of developing people mentally to deal with the struggles that we need to build into our practice and doing both and teaching them about both. I think sometimes people only talk about practice design or only talk about mental, but I like that Venn diagram of finding the middle ground of like, let's get right mentally, but then show you how to apply it. So that's been a journey that I went on. It was only practice design for a while. Then it was only mental stuff for a while. Now it's that marriage of both and showing people how they work together. I've just been lucky because I've had like, this is my job. I have time to kind of thrash around. And from the start, I just invested a lot of time and money meeting the scientists. So whenever I can, if I read a study that I like or a book that I like, I'm going to go try to hang out with the people that did the study. And I've been lucky to do that quite a bit. And when you get out there in person and ask them questions, you start to see how the dots connect to bigger topics and how relevant that particular topic might be. And so that's been something from the start, I've invested a lot in that. And I still do it now. I don't travel as much now, but whether it's on Zoom or for our podcast interviews, the more time we're interviewing and talking to people smarter than us, whether that's researchers or great coaches, that's always a good idea. Because again, as you go, you start to see how the dots connect, and then you're creating this bigger web of topics and learning.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I definitely resonate with that. It's funny, often people kind of concentrate on what separates, different philosophies or different things. But when you look into it, there's a lot of things that overlap, don't they, in terms of great coaches, be it in different sports or even different performance levels. You start to see, okay, that person, this person are saying something kind of similar, and this person over here is kind of on the same page, and it starts to ring true.
And I think it's good to even look outside of the sports world. So it's like, there's a lot of research in the education world that could help people in sports. There's a lot of ideas in the startup and tech community about how they innovate and experiment that could help us. So I think it's also good to look outside of our buckets. And then you start to see it's like, oh, that's a really good way to approach and solve this problem. And we could use a similar tactic here. And so like, that's kind of, I was lucky to stumble into that. Like the trainings and workshops that I provide, I do a lot in the sports world, but honestly, most of my work is in education in the corporate world. And as you dip into those buckets, you start to see how different tactics might apply from one to the other.
So tell us a bit about your business. So obviously that's on kind of, I guess, initially you were, like you say, in that domain of sport, but things have expanded. So tell us, what does it look like? I guess a day in the life of Trevor, what does that look like?
I think there's 3 things that I care about. The first we mentioned is the learning side, which is reading studies, reaching out to researchers and trying to conduct those interviews to learn more. The second is content production. I love that. So it's, I think our podcast is really good. I think the best thing we do are the videos that we produce. And then I try to write. And so I'm trying to push content through the website as much as we can. And then the third bucket is like the actual workshop, which is usually about 4 or 5 hours, where we will spend that with a group of leaders or members of a group, and go through everything and show how it connects. And basically the workshop is like, here is the science of becoming a better learner, and here's how to use it. And that's what takes up most of my time. It's like I'm doing workshops all the time. Like just this week I've done 4. So it's like that takes up a lot of time, and I love it. But yeah, those are the 3 categories that matter to me, and that's what I spend all my time on.
I think it's really interesting because I think there is like an emerging need. I've been chatting to Joe Eisenman, who's kind of, a big researcher in the area of talent development and growth and maturation kind of stuff. And he's saying, do you know what, actually, I don't necessarily think that we need more research. We need more people to be able to apply it, what we've already got, because we were just stacking it up, but no one's interpreting it and giving it to the everyday man, which is what you're doing.
Yeah. I kind of
saying, we've got all this stuff, but how does that apply?
I kind of see myself as like the translator. It's first, I think, and it's not because I'm special, I just spent a lot of time on it, which is showing how different topics connect. Because if it's just a one-off topic, sometimes you don't see the why or purpose. It's like, well, that's interesting, but I don't see how it like affects me. But when you start to connect multiple topics, you create a bigger narrative. You're like, oh, I see how this plays out in the learning equation. And then I think, because I spent so much time thinking about it, writing about it, making videos and sharing, I've gotten really good at explaining complicated material in a way that people can understand it. And I think that's the name of the game, because if the goal is we want people to use these ideas, but if we can't explain it so they understand it, they're not going to use it. And so I spend a lot of time not trying to dumb stuff down, but just use a universal language that people are like, oh, I see what that means, and now I see how to use it. And so I'm kind of the translator or the megaphone. It's like, I want to give the love and attention to the scientists, but I want to explain it so people can use it.
I think that's one of the dangers, and I think it was Made to Stick that I was reading by Chip and Dan Heath, but it was talking about how you get stuck in speaking expertise, and actually the layman or the coach around the corner who's coaching the local team or the whatever, he doesn't understand all the terminology you're using and all these kind of concepts, and it's actually being able to distill down, take away all the things that maybe aren't that vital, but the concept, and making it accessible and making it applicable. And then you can see the lights come on and people go, yeah, that makes sense, and know how to apply it. But they're not going to get that from reading a journal article, are they?
And it's hard to access the articles. It's hard to kind of like synthesize like how this plays into the other topics. It's really hard. And I struggle with that too. But again, that's another reason to reach out to the scientists, because you're like, well, what about this? Like, oftentimes you think that these are 2 separate areas of research, but then they're friends. Like that happened to me at the start. It's like I was studying practice design, and I was interviewing this guy what was his name? Richard Schmidt. And he sort of like wrote the textbook on this stuff. And then I found this other guy named Robert Bjork, who studied more of the education stuff. And I interviewed him, and it's like, oh yeah, we're good friends. A lot of our stuff overlaps. We talk about it all the time. But you would never know that unless you like go in and have those conversations. So, yep.
And a lot of times, actually, as you kind of mentioned, sometimes things have been misinterpreted. Like you only need to delve into, Anders Ericsson's work on 10,000 hours to realize that that's been taken pretty far out of context, and a whole load of things have been based on that just completely weren't what he was saying.
Absolutely not. It's like, and if I was them, I would be incredibly frustrated. I think in a way that happened to Carol Dweck's like growth mindset. It probably happens to a lot of these researchers where it's like, whoa, what you're saying is not even what our research says or what we have ever claimed. But like over time, the game of telephone, it like the message gets dampened down. So again, that's a reason that it's good to go to the source and ask the question. I was lucky to get to interview Anders a couple times. Unfortunately, he like passed away. But in those conversations, you see, it's like, wow, like the 10,000 hour rule and all this stuff. It's like, he's like, yeah, that's not really what our research is talking about at all. So I don't know.
And especially when people take it from one domain and then apply it to the other. Like the classic one is, the aspect of 10,000 hours being with musicians. And I mean, at the end of the day, it's still an average. So it could be, 5,000, or it could be 15,000, or maybe some people 50,000. But then people take that and apply it to track and field. And it's like, well, actually, that's a physical domain. There's other things involved in terms of strength and power and speed and physical development. It's not, you're comparing chalk and cheese. But people have taken that and written whole documents on long-term athletic development based off 10,000 hours.
Yeah. And I think the other frustrating thing is like that concept was, they were researching and what they cared about is like expert level performance. And I think sometimes if that isn't explained properly, that can actually have a destructive impact on our capacity to grow. Most people listening, we don't have to master something for it to help us. We just have to get kind of good. You can get kind of good in a week or a month, depending on what the skill is. And so it's sometimes this 10,000 hours is playing in our head, and it's such a daunting number that we don't start a learning journey, when the truth is it's like, oh, you can learn enough to be dangerous in a short amount of time if you practice enough in the right way. And so we don't have to be masters at a skill for it to be relevant. And I think that's something really important for people to understand. We can all get better at stuff, much better than you know, and we can do it in a relatively short amount of time. So that's kind of where we spend it. Don't let mastery be the enemy of learning. It's like, you don't have to master everything.
And I think even just that concept of deliberate practice, like, you know, even that in itself has been taken out of context, and people going, yeah, so we need to do 3 hours a day every day for X amount of time. I was like, no, that's not what he's saying. You probably couldn't do 3 hours in a row of deliberate practice because it would be so draining.
Yep. And even getting clear on like his definition of deliberate practice is hard because you need an expert coach with you. And so actually what most of us are engaged in is purposeful practice, where it's like we're trying our best for this to be technically deliberate practice, but maybe we don't have an expert coach at our side, but we're getting scrappy and we're doing it. And so it's like just getting clear on like, all right, again, it's not rocket science. It's like, we want to pick a specific thing that we want to get better at. We want to practice it a lot, but we want that practice to be high quality. We want it to be intentional. We want it to stretch us. We want it to challenge us. It's like, those are the things that we need to do more of. And there's no like blueprint other than that. It's not like, and do that for 5 hours a day. It's just like, no, do that more. Like, do that more. It's not fun, but do that more. It's like, if I wanted to get better at public speaking, I could go to my grandma and say, Grandma, I want to get better at public speaking. Should I just give my talk in front of the mirror a bunch of times? And she'd say, maybe not. And then I'd say, Grandma, what would be a better way? And she'd say, maybe you should do it in front of people. Boom. Like, there you go. Grandma is a learning expert. It's like, absolutely right. Now that gets into those foundational things we mentioned earlier, that our preference is to do it in front of the mirror because that's easy, that's safe. It doesn't really challenge me. There's really no struggle involved. It's much more uncomfortable to do it in front of people, but it's better. It's better to do that practice. After I spend a little time alone doing it in front of people, that's higher quality reps. And I could actually do less of those than the mirror ones and see a bigger leap, bigger improvement.
That's really interesting, because I'm just, as you're saying that, it's making me think of coaches that I've worked with in the past who probably actually adhered to that really well. And you know, one of the things I'm thinking of is a coach who said, right, you know, this is the scenario, you get one crack at this. And, you know, the temptation as a coach is to always finish on a good rep, isn't it? But the problem is we're then taking the pressure off, because it's like, well, we can give you another shot. But this coach said, no, we're going to have one of these scenarios here, you get it or you don't. Okay, now we move on. One of these scenarios here, you get it or you don't. So that is like a real world competitive pressure, isn't it? Whereas we don't tend to do that in training that much.
Yep. And it's like, you could go really deep into some of those principles, but in the end, it's like, whenever we can start to introduce variables that we'll see in the performance into our practice, it's usually better. We don't have to go like off the rails with that, but just incorporating a bit more of that is better. And like, kind of the fun metaphor we use to think about that is like, if you think about a zoo tiger and a jungle tiger, when we compete, no matter what sport we're talking about, that's the jungle. It's wild, it's chaotic, it's unpredictable. Every game is different, just like every day is different in the wild and the jungle. The problem is, a lot of times we practice in the zoo, but then we expect our athletes to perform in the jungle. And that would be the equivalent of taking a tiger out of the zoo and putting it into the jungle. It doesn't stand a chance because it's not prepared. So you could again go back to the 5-year-old and say, okay, if I want to be able to survive in the jungle, what should I do? Well, I should spend time in the jungle like the jungle tiger. It's like, yeah, now you can use that same logic in how we practice. We can't just practice in the zoo all the time and then expect our athletes to survive in the wild. So incorporating variables that we see in the game, in the jungle, into our practice, it's usually going to be better.
Hmm. So take us on the journey of how you've gone from just having that personal interest and kind of that desire for knowledge and learning to how that's become, I guess, I mean, for want of a better word, that's become your business. But you obviously then stepped away from just being personally interested to helping other people get involved and educating them. So what did that look like and how's that evolved?
Mm. It was kind of by accident. Like when I first started, this was just a blog, and I was like, I had some time on my hands and money saved up. And I was like, well, I'm just going to write some stuff and share it and see what happens. And that kind of took off. Like people liked the stuff that we were sharing. And over time, that led to the workshops. And so I don't really know how that started other than it was like, oh, this stuff is interesting. I was doing a lot of basketball camps and using this stuff and seeing great results. And I was like, we need to be writing about this. Like, this is awesome. And then like kind of one thing leads to another. It's like the right person reading a blog post and reaching out. So one of my earlier posts that kind of got some traction, it was something like, great practice isn't built for YouTube. And it was basically like, yeah, like you see all this stuff on YouTube, but it's kind of just like stunts that look cool, but they're not necessarily the best for skill development. And it was a pretty good article. And the Olympic women's volleyball team staff read it here, and then they reached out, and then I got to go hang out with them and learn from them. And so everything kind of snowballs, but I guess the origin was just like committing to sharing good stuff.
So you've obviously mentioned, the Olympic women's volleyball team, but you've worked with some pretty big organizations and a good variety. So give us a bit of a tour of some of the highlights in terms of the journey so far.
Maybe one, it happens quite a bit where after a workshop, I'm like, whoa, I can't believe that just happened. One was I did a presentation with learning managers from the United Nations last year. That was one of the, like, I can't even believe that that's real life. I've done a lot of work with the Cleveland Indians. So getting to the Major League Baseball level was cool. Couple Olympic teams. And honestly, the work that I'm the most proud of, and I wish I was doing it more, I've done a few workshops inside of prisons. And to get in there and like connect with those people and have those conversations, that was pretty cool. Like I learned a ton from that. And then I'm also super lucky that I get to work with a lot of schools. And oftentimes when I work with a school, it'll be like a day with the teachers, but then the next day will be with students in like smaller groups. So getting to work with young kids where you're like teaching them some of this stuff, you'd like to think that that would make a difference. And sometimes you can actually see like the light bulb go off where they're like, oh, it's okay to be afraid. It's okay to be nervous. I can learn more than I realized. Like that's really cool. So there are some like big name clients, but again, every group that I work with, I'm just super lucky. And every time I do it, I learn a little bit more. It makes me better for the next one.
I've always thought it's really interesting to see the approach that people take. So often like, in sports academies and college teams and stuff like that, people will get a psychologist or a consultant to come in and work with the athletes directly. Like, we've got a problem, come in and fix them. But then you get this flip side, which is actually come in and work with the staff and the coaches, because we see these people every day and we can reinforce the message. Yep. And it's interesting to see which way people go, because I've always thought you're going to get far more bang for your buck working with the staff who can then reinforce that message for the next 10 seasons than, the one, a one-on-one athlete or a very small group of athletes. So do you have a preference for who you work with? Or
I side with you on that. It's like when you're working with a leader, then it can spread. So if you're limited on time, of course but if you have enough time, it's good to like do it all. So like a couple of schools that I've been working with, they have me work with the parents, then the teachers, then the students. It's like, so everyone's kind of speaking the same language. I like that a lot, but like you said, if we're limited in schedule, and we usually are, it's like, I prefer the leaders, because if you can plant the seeds and give them the tools to use some of this stuff and teach it to their people, you're in good shape.
Mm. So what have been some of the challenges for you? Like, I mean, as we all know, nothing ever goes 100% smooth. So what have been some of the challenges for you in kind of delving into this world and trying to help people understand how sometimes our own mindsets can kind of be holding us back?
I think maybe the challenge for me is I wasn't like necessarily like an outgoing person who's in front of a mic, in front of a camera a lot. And so if I look back when I first started, I could see I was super insecure in the way I taught. And I tried to like overcorrect that. And I was yelling a lot and like shaming a lot, like everything you do is wrong. You got to do this. And it was just like, oh, I watch my old videos and I like cringe. And I know it was coming from a place of insecurity. Like I wanted to prove that I was smart and energetic, and all that yelling and screaming. It's like, that's not the best way to teach stuff like this. You don't have to be shaming people and telling them that they're wrong or that they're like closed-minded because they don't use this stuff. And so I think the biggest challenge for me is just becoming a better teacher and communicator. And I was like looking at old videos and comparing them to the videos that we filmed like 2 weeks ago. And it's like, whoa, the leap that I've made in the communication style has been awesome. It's like now I'm not yelling and screaming on a stage. Oftentimes I sit and it's like more of a conversation, and it's slow and it's controlled. And it's just like, it would be like us grabbing a beer, and like, that's my presentation style now, versus the hyping, the yelling, the trying to be like over the top funny or in high energy. It's just like more authentic and real. And so for me, like that's been the personal challenge, is getting better at that skill. For the other challenges would be just like helping people see how different topics might be used mostly in one industry, but they're also relevant in another. And so like finding ways to connect that is very important.
Mm. So obviously you transitioned from, being called Train Ugly to the Learner Lab. What was it that prompted that switch? Was it just the kind of preconceptions of people, or did you want to reframe things a bit?
Yep. One is Train Ugly is a great name. I will still go to bat on it, but
Yeah,
a lot of people thought it was like a fitness company, and it wasn't. So that was kind of boxing me in. And then the bigger picture is my goal is to figure out how to become a better learner. Training Ugly is a pillar of that, but it's not the whole equation. Like there's more to becoming a better learner than just being willing to struggle and face more challenges in practice. It's also about growth mindset. It's also about emotional intelligence. It's also about resilience. And so the Learner Lab is a better name for what I'm doing. And Train Ugly is a strong pillar of that, but it's not the whole thing. And so I just think it's a better name for what it is that we care about. And then of course we still talk about the tenets of Training Ugly. It's very important. Like that's very important if we're trying to grow.
I think it's really interesting because, I mean, I've worked in a lot of kind of sporting academies and, currently work for a national governing body. And it's funny because you see the same patterns repeated again. So, we'll allocate time to technical training, we'll allocate time to video analysis, and we'll allocate time to strength and conditioning. But then we don't really do the same for nutrition or psychology, when they can be things that are so fundamental. If your head's not right and you haven't got any food in your body, you're probably not going to train that well. So it's interesting to see the same patterns repeated over and over again, and that people don't think about allocating that same sort of time to the mental side of things that they do with the other things. There's just this kind of little conversations that happen to and from the gym or to and from the training pitch. But I think maybe there's a little bit of fear there, and that people think, well, that's not my realm. But a lot of the stuff is really fundamental, basic concepts, isn't it?
It's fundamental, it's basic, and it's not like we're not asking people to sacrifice their practice time and all of that other stuff that matters. This supplements it. This helps people get more from the practice time. It's not like, oh, you have to take away from this to do this. It's like, no, if you do this and build this foundation, our athletes get more from the practice and they can sustain more of that action. And like, that's of course what we care about. So this like helps that.
Yeah, I think that's massive. And it's funny because it always seems to be, I've sat in a lot of meetings where athletes get selected or get deselected and things like that. And a lot of times there's a few things that come out that are kind of easy go-tos that don't need much explanation, almost like an excuse, like, oh, well, he's just not fast enough, nothing you can do about that, or his head's just not in the right place. And it's, sometimes you think, well, actually, how much have you actually invested in that? Have you actually spent, as a group, not even a one-on-one, but as a group, do we even talk about that side of things? Do we talk about resilience? Do we talk about the growth mindset, or do we just say they've got it or they don't have it?
Yep.
And
Yeah, and it's tough in the world of sports because there are some like physical things. Like there are going to be athletes that are more like agile than others or have better balance or whatever. And like, of course, everyone can get better at those things, and some are going to be ahead of others and go at different speeds. Like that's the case. But when we're talking about skills, it's like, look, we can all get better at any skill if we're actually allowed to practice it.
Definitely. And I think that's one of those things, like you're saying, the fundamental things around just understanding the growth mindset and kind of giving people the option to say, do you realize you can, you're not a cemented concept. Your identity can shift and your skills can change and develop. Gives people a bit of freedom, but it does kind of start to, I don't know about I guess I could probably take a stab in terms of what you think about talent, but that's always a bit of a get out as well, isn't it? It's, oh, well, he's just much more talented than me. And often I'm like, well, I know what that guy does. He just does more work than you do.
Right. Yeah. I think there's obviously some physical things that we're born with that can separate us, but the actual skills are almost always built and earned. It's just sometimes hard to pinpoint exactly how that happens because learning is messy and we're so different in so many different ways. And so sometimes when we can't pinpoint why the person's better, we just chalk it up to like, oh, you're just a natural. But the truth is there's probably something that happened backstage that we just can't pinpoint, which is why they're more skilled in this particular area. And the bottom line is it doesn't really matter. Like, it doesn't matter. It's like, I don't really care if, oh, like this skill, you're better because you practice more or you're natural, whatever, because let's like look forward. The science is clear that whatever starting point we have, we can get better at any skill if we practice enough in the right way. And so like, who cares what we started with? We can all move up. And so I'm going to spend most of my time talking about that because like that's crystal clear in the research. We can all get better at pretty much any skill. And like, that's not me just trying to be inspiring. That's like, I interviewed a guy named Michael Merzenich, and he's known as like the father of neuroplasticity. He's been studying brains since 1970. And he straight up said on the interview that our research is crystal clear. It shows that absolutely anyone can get better at virtually any skill. Doesn't mean we're going to master every skill, but you can get much better than you think. And so that's the way I think about it.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you on that one. So if you, let's say you're kind of in my position, you're working with, fairly young athletes, sort of 14, 15 years old. If there were 2 or 3 key things that you would try to get across, what would be those fundamental things that you think could open the door to those bigger conversations?
I'd start with growth mindset, and I would really try to hammer home this belief that we can get better at stuff. I would tell them that. I would present the science. I would show them this clip of Michael Merz, like anything I can do to help them understand my brain is built to learn. And when I use it right, it can learn. And then the second, equally important, is getting in the weeds about when I'm learning something new and it's stretching me out of the comfort zone, it's going to feel weird. It is okay to feel weird. So many times we assume like, oh, if I'm nervous or I'm afraid or I'm feeling discomfort, that means I'm doing something wrong or that means I'm not ready. When the truth is that just means you're a human and it means you're stretched. It's called a comfort zone for a reason. So if we get out of it, it no longer feels comfortable. And so we spend a ton of time, no matter what group we're working with, whether it's kids or adults, getting into the weeds of like how we talk about discomfort, helping people understand that is human to feel like that. It's okay to feel like that. Might not be fun to feel like that, but that's okay. And so we're really, really, really spending time on that one because that can help us sustain the action. In a way, what we're trying to do is the way that we normally talk about fear and discomfort gives it a lot of power over our actions. It's like, it's either going to steer me away from those situations, or I'm in that situation and I feel fear. And then I'm like worried that I'm afraid and nervous that I'm afraid, and it all snowballs. And so the solution to giving our emotions less power is not suppressing them and fighting them. It's just teaching people about them so we can learn to accept them and understand them. And that seems complicated, but it's not. It's just giving people permission to feel and just equipping them with that knowledge. And so before any learning journey, one way we're going to prep the group is like, look, we're going to stretch you and it's going to feel weird, and that's okay. That's expected. So we're like changing the way we talk about those type of emotions, and that will help them sustain that action that's going to take place outside of the comfort zone.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, especially for, young athletes and talent development, because that if an athlete's fairly talented, they're probably used to that comfort zone in terms of, winning far more than most people would win at their age group, or being the kid who's top of the roster, or the first pick, or that kind of stuff. And that works, as long as that stays the situation, it works. But the second they become the small fish in the big pond, you see that kind of look of the rabbit in the headlights of like, I don't know what to do here. This has never happened. It's because actually they're now finally out of their comfort zone.
They've been stretched.
They've never been prepared for it.
Yep. And so if we can mentally prepare them for that, then when they are stretched, they're like, this is what he's talking about. I'm in the jungle now. This can help me. And so if we're prepping them with this knowledge, they start to reframe the challenge. So our old school way is, I'm stretched into the jungle. This makes me feel weird. This is bad. Versus if we spend the time and laid this foundation, it's, oh, wow, this is stretching me. I'm in the jungle. I feel weird. This is an opportunity for me to get better. And like that shift could make a huge difference in that athlete's capacity to grow. And it can only be done by laying the foundation. You can't just say, hey, this is going to be an opportunity to grow. It's like, no, you got to lay the foundation, because it's going to be emotional. It's going to create some discomfort and feelings. And you need to like spend the time up front. So then when they are stretched, they're like, this is what they're talking about. Like whether you're using the jungle and zoo metaphor or any of the stuff we've been talking about, it's like, it's all important. So when the moment comes, they're like, this is what he was saying. This is it. I'm in the jungle now. So that's what we're after.
Yeah, I think you've got some really great analogies and metaphors that you use. Like, I think there was that first, one of the first things I saw was your growth mindset video where you kind of put that out, and the jungle tiger analogy, but so many great things that you're using that make those principles really accessible, like learn like a scientist. Scientists learn because experiments don't work. They have 100% success rate, but we're so, we've got such a bias against failure, don't we?
Yeah. It's like, the way I think about it is, for all these principles, you just got to look around and there's people using them. That's how I write about it. It's like, even like stand-up comedians are great learners, because think about how they shape their content. It's like, they have their, I have my special and it's my set. It's really good. Now it's time to make a new one. What do? I write rough ideas, and then I go to a club and I read them off this paper and I test them live in front of people. And so even Chris Rock, even Dave Chappelle, they bomb sometimes when they're testing new material, but they know it takes me about a year, and I have to go and test and test and test and test and test and test in front of real people. And that's how I develop my new hour special. It's like, whoa, I can't believe how uncomfortable that would be. Like, imagine being Dave Chappelle and there's a paying audience and you're like, yeah, I'm going to bomb. I have to test new stuff right now. It's like, I can't even believe how like courageous that is, but that's how they all do it. And it's like, I bet we could all like steal from that approach and spend more time running small experiments in a live situation and like letting those small experiments stack up over time. It's like, I bet we could all figure out a way to do that more. Doesn't mean we have to go become stand-up comedians, but it's like, what if we ran more experiments, more small experiments? It's like, we could all do that. And so if you just kind of look around at like the world, you could see people doing these things. And then that's how I like to talk about them.
No, it's really interesting, because I think that's, it's again, all these concepts are all wrapped up, aren't they? But if you have that self-concept of I'm talented and I nail it 100% of the time, then to put yourself in that situation where this could be a home run or I could strike out here, that really conflicts with your self-identity, doesn't it? But if you prepared a learner and said, look, I don't care about the outcome here. I want you to learn from this situation. So I want you to try stuff. It might work, it might not. But the key thing is that you come away and you've learned something that frames that situation. But again, that it all comes back to that, fixed mindset or growth mindset kind of idea sometimes.
And it's kind of just knowing, like, look, there's a time and a place for all of this. So Dave Chappelle doesn't experiment with new content when they're filming his Netflix special. He experimented backstage for a long time preparing for this. Just like I'm not asking people to like experiment during like the championship match either. It's like, no, but that's the beauty of sports is we have time during practice. So we want to run experiments backstage. And another trick is shrink the experiment. We don't have to like run this huge experiment every time. So in my workshops, like there's some of these groups that I've worked with, and it's been like 4 or 5 times in the last 5 years. And there's a group I worked with last month and they're like, oh, wow, your stuff is so much better. It's like really, really, really good now. It's way better than it used to be. And we thought it was good 5 years ago. And it's true. It's way better and way different now, but it's not because every January 1st, I delete my whole program and build it up from scratch. Of course I don't. And it's not because I like reinvent it live. It's anytime I give a workshop, my rule is I have to run one small experiment. It could be as small as changing the order or telling a different story or giving a different example. And because I'm doing so many workshops, all of those small experiments stack up over time where like, yeah, in a year I made a huge change, but it wasn't that risky. It wasn't like I had to go in and be like, okay, this is a brand new workshop. It's like, no, I'm testing little bits out and weaving them into the current program. So these small experiments, they make it a little bit less risky and easier to do and leading to a big change. So we can experiment backstage when we have like the resources and time, or if we don't have backstage time, shrink the experiment. And so you're doing it live during the performance, but when it's shrunken down, it's lower risk, easier to do. And then those can stack up over time. So I think about that a lot, whether it's, okay, can I find some backstage time to test this out? So for me, backstage time would be, if I'm prepping like a new video or podcast episode, I want to try to explain that to a 7th grader. Like I'm going to find a 7th grader and I'm going to explain it to him because I want to test how I'm explaining this. And can I help them understand? Like that's my backstage time. And then the live experiment is during the workshop, I'm trying to adjust one thing or the other and see how the people respond to that. So a little bit of both is good, but that's a way to experiment more even when the outcome is precious and the performance matters. And so I think about that a lot.
I guess a real central part to that is being able to depersonalize failure, isn't it? And see failure as feedback rather than condemnation of you and your personality and your skill set.
Yeah. And that goes back to like the feeling tough emotions bit. Cause like if we're trained to believe that when we fail and we feel these tough emotions, that's a sign of weakness or that it's bad to feel like that, we're going to steer away. And once we're taught that it's okay to feel like that can help us do it more. And then the other way to do that more is just to sell people on the value of it. So it's like, if I understand the value of the experiment or the struggle or the mistake, I'm more likely to do it. It's like working out. We're taught from like a young age, it's like the 9th through 12th rep where we're kind of struggling a bit. Like, we all know that those are the ones that really help me grow. And so I'm more likely to do stuff like that and rep it out to the 12th, even though it hurts, even though I'm struggling, because I know that's how I change my body. The same blueprint works for building a skill. And once I know the value of the struggle, of the experiment, I'm more likely to do it. And so again, it goes back to when we're sharing this stuff with people, we got to spend more time teaching them the purpose and reasoning behind these things. That was a big error I made early on, is like I learned about this stuff and then I would just create the practice and throw them into the fire and be like, yep, this is good, go for it. Now we spend time like, all right, this is why we're doing this drill. This is why I'm making it harder. This is why I'm creating struggle. And once the athletes start to see the value of this stuff, they're more apt to do the thing and actually see the value of it. And that's what we're after.
Mm. So, I mean, obviously, you know, your content is fantastic, and I'd recommend any coaches, parents, any of the people who are listening to go and check out your videos and your blog articles, because they are top class and do, as you say, distill some of those concepts down. But if people were interested in getting stuck in a little bit more, are there any books or any other resources you would point people to that maybe piqued your attention that you think would be suitable for others?
We mentioned Anders Ericsson earlier. Peak by Anders Ericsson is really, really good. That will go through some of this stuff. That's one of my favorite learning books lately. If you're talking about the feeling tough emotion side of the equation, Emotional Agility by Susan David is really good. I also like The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield, as far as like changing the way we think about fear. And for like the resilience side of the equation, I really like Rising Strong by Brene Brown. So that kind of hits everything we've talked about. But those are some resources that I really like.
Awesome. And finally, where can people find out more about you and your work? What are the best kind of channels to consume your content in?
Yeah, if you just go to thelearnerlab.com, everything is there. It's all free. So the videos, I like our podcast. We have a lot of content on the way. But yeah, everything that we've ever made is on thelearnerlab.com, and then links to the like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and all of that is there as well.
So what's next for you and for Learner Lab? What have you got coming up?
I'm doing a big video project where I set up a studio during this quarantine and filmed my entire 5-hour program. And then I'm chopping it up into 10-minute segments, but then producing it out. So it's like really high impact 10-minute segments that people can go through. So that's taking forever. And then there's some topics that I'm starting to dip my toe into that I think are really fascinating moving forward. I'm really curious about how we design our environment to help us sustain actions, and getting into like the behavioral econ side of things, and habit building research is, I think, interesting. So I see myself kind of going in that direction moving forward.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time today, Trevor. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you. And as I said, I would really recommend that people go and check out your stuff, because it is top class and will really help a lot of coaches out.
Appreciate it. Thank you.